Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here. It is time for the final LEC domestic video of the year. It's time for my LEC Round 3 semifinals and finals overview and analysis video. I know we're kind of combining a lot of stages of the LEC into one video here, but they had this big long break. They had a 1-week gap in between the end of round number 2 and the start of round number 3, and then they played all of the remaining 3 series back to back to back, and so I just felt it would be easiest to cover them all in one video. You guys know I've been posting basically every day as it is already. I try to avoid doubling up on videos as much as possible, try to post daily. So wanted to make sure I got this video out in a reasonable amount of time, and that means that we're combining all of these videos together. That being said, what that essentially means is that by the end of this video, not only are we going to officially know our third team from the LEC that has qualified for Worlds, but we're going to know the order that those teams are going in, the first, the second, and the third seed, because we are going to know our LEC champion here for the summer split. I'm excited. I hope you guys are as well. If you are, let me know down in the comment section below. What did you expect from these series? Who did you expect to come out and get that third seed? We'll talk about that in our first series. And how did you think the finals and everything kind of leading up to that were going to go? Did it live up to your expectations? Were you surprised by the outcomes? Always very curious to know where you guys land on those things. But without further ado, let's get into things. If you watched yesterday's video on the LCK finals, you're going to be decently familiar with the format. We are going to start off with our round 3 and then semifinals video, but I guess series by series, doing the big overview, and then once we get into grand finals here, the championship matchup for the LEC, we will transition into game-by-game breakdowns for that series. So we're going to kind of be using 2 different formats here. It just makes the most sense to kind of get this video out as quickly as possible, but we're going to be going over everything every single team did, from the advantages to the disadvantages to what that means for these teams moving forward. I'll be giving either a player of the series or individual player of the games for each game/series that we cover, and we'll be doing the same for dud of the series/dud of the game. I will be giving a finals MVP at the end of the final series that we cover, and then most of the end of this video will be spent talking about what I expect from these teams at the World Championships, because that's all that remains. Domestic play is over here in Europe, and all that matters is what these teams will do now that international play is starting. But you guys know, for the most part, we're going to spend this video talking about the series themselves, so let's get into our first one. And arguably, this is the most important series that we are going to talk about today, despite it being the earliest in the playoffs, because this is the battle for that third seed and that third and final spot at the World Championships. Of course, you can still do better than this. It means you stay alive at the very least in the playoffs, but you have to win. The loser of this series is done for the rest of the year, and the winner goes to Worlds. And so it's all or nothing for these 2 teams. It was the number 2 seed from Group B in Fnatic taking on the number 2 seed from Group A in Corp. And Fnatic is going to shock the world and pick up the victory here. I would say that I'm entirely surprised, but honestly, there was a part of me that's just like, man, even with Fnatic being bad and, generally not being a consistent top 3 team at all throughout this year, this organization kind of refuses to miss Worlds, even if they're never really an actual threat at the World Championships. They've not been in a good run of form as an organization in comparison to their own individual standards over the past couple of years, consistently being the 2nd or 3rd best team in the LEC, but they always do seem to manage to get into that top 3 and get themselves a Worlds berth, and once again, they are capable of doing that in 2025 when, quite frankly, I felt like it was stacked against them the most. I think this is probably the weakest version of Fnatic that we've had in many years, and yet they still are able to get that top 3 spot. As for Corp on the other side, this is a nightmarishly bad result. I don't think there's any excuse for this team and this organization not making Worlds in 2025. Not only were you the first champions of the LEC back in the winter split, but on paper, from a pure roster construction and talent standpoint, you could make the argument that they are the most talented team in the league. For them to not make Worlds and to be 4th place, it's just unacceptable. And I get that Corp fans are kind of going crazy. I do want to make some statements on that, I guess, very quickly here. 2 things can be true at once. Corp is not supposed to miss Worlds. This roster really has no justification for not missing Worlds. But at the same time, if you are one of those people that's going online and like actively DMing these players and, calling them out and being a part of that toxic fan base to tell them that they should kill themselves because they didn't win a League of Legends series, like, go find help. Like, genuinely, get yourself fixed, because you should not be online. Like, that is not healthy human behavior. There is a lot that kind of needs to be, adjusted in the community when it comes to that. I understand that likely if you're watching watching my videos, you're not one of those people because, you know, I kind of discourage that kind of behavior on this channel, but certainly something that I feel like needs to be said considering all the controversy surrounding K-Corp both in and out of game right now. But, you know, at the end of the day, Fnatic won this series and they're the team that's going to be going to Worlds, and a lot of that is off the back of how phenomenal oscarinin ended up playing on the top side of the map. I think there is an argument that this is his best of 5 ever. I really do think that when they needed him the most, he absolutely stepped up. Kana was supposed to absolutely gap oscarinin. One of the big reasons why I felt K-Corp was going to be such a lock for the World Championships is I just don't know outside of Broken Blade if there's any top laner that can consistently go up against Kana and actually generate leads. It's just kind of a vacant void right now in the LEC for top laners that are at this caliber and at this level. Kana, in my opinion, and I've stated this a lot, has been the best player in Europe across 2025, and in the biggest moment, he let this team down, and oscarinin was, quite frankly, just better on the other side. He is the obvious choice for player of the series here. And he did it really in all 3 of their wins. He did it on the Mbessa, he did it on the Zion, and he did it on the Gwen in game number 4. I think specifically on that Gwen in game number 4. He was an absolute menace for this team. He's so good on weak side when he does kind of get to play that weak side role where he gets to kind of play neutral. I think that that's always kind of the ideal thing for him. If you dive him and, you know, put a lot of resources into trying to shut him down, oftentimes he can still be, you know, shut down. He can be taken out of the game in that kind of way. It's why I've never considered him an elite kind of top laner, because he doesn't necessarily turn bad game states into good game states like a lot of the best top laners do. But from neutral, this guy is just about as good as you could ask for. He's had the best year of his career so far in 2025, and I think he ultimately just cemented that here. And, you know, cemented their decision to keep him. I know that there was a lot of questions about whether or not Oscar was the right guy in the top lane. Well, here you go. In the biggest of moments, he is the player to step up and really get this team to Worlds. Really happy for Oscar and quite surprised to see this be the outcome of this series. I want to give a big shout out to the bot lane as well. You know, as per usual, Upset's KDA looks absolutely ridiculous. It does every single series this guy plays. It's looked ridiculous every stop he's been on in his entire career. It's just the way that he operates individually as a player. He's always going to have these ridiculously good KDAs, and this series was no exception. Do I think he was always the main character? Maybe, right? I mean, you're looking at 3 wins and it's Kai'Sa, Zeri, Yunara, right? Like, obviously these are champions that are kind of main character champions, hyper carries for the later part of the game, and Upset does play into that role well. But do I think he was the one actively pushing the game forward? Maybe not quite as much as oscarinin was on the top side, who I think more than earned this player of the series. But Upset was still very good. He definitely outplayed Kaliste, and they were put in kind of different scenarios. You know, Kaliste playing a lot more versatile, a lot more jack of all trades types of AD carries, things like the Varus, the Ezreal, the Xayah, things like that, whereas Upset is kind of put fully onto these hyper carries. Definitely different roles and investments from their team, but Upset certainly was more valuable in this series. Mickey X I thought was really good. Sometimes he was over aggressive. I think his game 3 on the Rel was not particularly consistent, but I think that at some point you just have to understand that the plays that he's going for at the very least are pushing the game forward for Fnatic, even if they're not always perfect plays. I talk about this all the time on the channel. Typically speaking, a good play is better than no play, even if it's not a great play, right? Like, you can make something happen on the map and push your game state forward, even if it's by an inch. If you take an inch like at 14 times throughout the series or throughout a game, then eventually you're going to have taken enough that you can push that mile forward. So I think Mickey's really good at that, at staying aggressive. Razork typically is very good at that. I think he was good in this series. I don't think he was excellent. I think that there were times where Yike ended up really misplaying in a lot of these fights, and Razork got to take advantage of that, but, you know, still fine. And then Poby really didn't make any mistakes. He was kind of just super consistent in the mid lane. For Fnatic, this was just a big series win. There was not a bigger best of 5 that this team played throughout all of 2025, and this was the time for them to step up. Not only have they gotten themselves a big win over K-Corp, but they've gotten themselves to Worlds. And then for K-Corp on the other side, like I said, this result is basically unacceptable. There's no real way to justify this happening for this team. There is no reason for them not to be at Worlds with the kind of talent and the kind of infrastructure that they have available to them, especially with the way that they were set up. They basically threw away the first seed in their group by losing a random game or a random series to Vitality in the regular season. And then, you know, from that point onwards, it was kind of cooked, and they just kind of got bad draws, and all of a sudden you lose one series you're not supposed to, and you're out of, you know, the entirety of 2025. This team will not play another game outside of, you know, some non-sanctioned Riot Cups, which I think is, you know, is still cool, but certainly not what they were looking for. And unfortunately, it's a pretty bad time for your best player to have the worst series he's played all year long. Kana's done of the series here. He got completely gapped by oscarinin. You know, there were some positive plays. I think there were moments on the Jax where you could see a lot of that aggression, and I think, you know, typically speaking, his laning is still all right, but he was going into deficits against oscarinin, who was the better laner in this series. It just didn't really feel like Kana, and I think that's the most frustrating part, is you need this guy to step up He was the biggest reason why I felt like this team was a lock for the World Championships, and, you know, him losing out in this series and costing them, you know, that's a big deal. That certainly is not something that should be overlooked. I think it's worth saying that Jungle Mid was also on completely different pages. There were multiple times throughout this series where it did not feel like they were trying to play together. Yike in particular had a really bad day in terms of where a lot of his consistency came from. You know, people are going to talk about Yike as somebody that underperforms in big moments. I think that that's kind of talking out their ass. Like, that's just wasn't the case on G2, and I get that G2 is in a completely different, you know, state. Like, that organization is much more consistent. You get to play with players like Caps, and obviously G2 are the kings of Europe. They naturally have a better infrastructure than everybody else, but, like, Yike is not a small game, you know, stat patter. That's just not who Yike is. He just had a bad series here today. I think Vladi did not play particularly well, but again, Vladi is the one that's receiving a lot of the criticism right now on social media. I'm certainly not sure he deserves that. You know, Kalista and Targamas were fine. I think they were the best part of K-Corp in this series, but at the end of the day, this reflects on all 5 of these members. Not only were they not able to make MSI in the spring split when they were expected to do so coming off of being the defending champions in the winter split, but they come back in summer with renewed expectations and with a team that feels like it's reignited, beating Movistar KOI in the regular season, being a team that really, you know, feels like they have the sauce to be top 3, and they just can't do it. Yet again, this organization comes up just a little bit short, and I think they're going to have to think about this all offseason. I don't know what changes on this roster look like, because I genuinely don't know from a player perspective where you are going to find talent upgrades, but something is broken on this team, and I guess we'll just have to wait and see what the fix ends up being. But for Fnatic, congratulations to this team. I know they really wanted to get to Worlds. They brought Poby in with the explicit intent to get to that World Championships, to get that top 3 seed, and they've now accomplished that. They're getting really big performances from players like Oscar Rinnan that they've stuck with over the course of the last few years, despite fan, you know, backlash and at times, you know, this channel being a little bit lower on Oscar, and Fnatic's really paying, you know, they're reaping the benefits, I should say, from that in all the positive ways. So congrats to Fnatic. This is a very big win. But that's going to bring us now to our semifinals, our lower bracket finals. And now that we know the teams that are locked in for Worlds, this series does have a little bit less of like the oomph that maybe it had before, but still, the winner of this guarantees themselves a top 2 seed going to Worlds, and of course, gets them into the finals. Teams still want to win the LEC after all. Like, this is not some worthless league that it doesn't matter if you win or lose, and, you know, the 1 seed versus 3 seed doesn't matter. You want to be that champion. You want to be that number 1 seed, and only one of these teams can advance to face G2. It was a matchup between the number 1 seed from Group A in Movistar KOI, and of course the number 2 seed from Group B in Fnatic. And Movistar KOI is going to pick up the 3-1 series win in eerily similar fashion to how Fnatic just dispatched K-Corp, and how that series ended up going, just kind of in the opposite fashion, where KOI had full pressure, full control of the entire map. I think basically everybody on the team ended up playing just about as well as you could ask for, and Fnatic really struggled at being able to play around their weak links. In this case, the savior, the hero from the previous series that gets them to the World Championships in Oscar Rinnan, ends up really letting them down and going 2-20 across these 4 games. Just an abysmal performance from him, and KOI was more than ready to take advantage of it. So we'll go ahead and talk about it here. Player of the series for me might go a bit against the grain here. I'm going to go with Elyoya in the jungle. I love how Mirwin played. I do think he was the better top laner by a large margin in this series, but I think Elyoya's pressure on the map at being able to open things up was likely the most important factor towards why KOI ended up getting such a big lead in this series, and why it was so difficult for Fnatic to find any pressure to come back. Razork played quite bad as well alongside Oscar Rinnan. I don't think that's getting talked about nearly enough, and I think the jungle gap to me was just as relevant. So I wanted to give some credit to the player that I think impacted the map the most, even if Mirwin also dominated his top lane matchup. But at the end of the day, player of the series should probably go to one of those two, either Elyoya or Mirwin, because they were just so good in this series. I'm just giving it again to Elyoya, mostly for games 3 and 4. I really think those were the games that opened everything up. Game 3 on the Jarvan was unbelievably good from Elyoya. I think the Nefiri was solid. I think the Pantheon was solid. He ends up, you know, being second on the team in kills. He's last in deaths, which is always a really good sign. Was a part of a lot of the plays that ended up being made. You know, I just think Elyoya doesn't get enough credit. I think when this guy is on, when he's playing his comfortable game and when he can control the map, things just get really easy for KOI, and it's really easy for them to win games. But you know what is also a big factor towards them winning games is Mirwin playing like a human being on the top side. It's funny to kind of talk about the top lane carousel that exists right now in the LEC, because typically you would just say, okay, well, you know, the better players almost always win, especially in these big high-profile best-of-5s, and Mirwin is a player that I do think struggles skills in best of fives. I think he is relatively limited in a fearless format at what he can do from a consistency standpoint, but I think he's taken a lot of steps over the course of 2025 to become a bit more versatile, to become a bit better at playing, well, the good top laners rather than just the off-meta ones that he's always been good at. And I think we saw kind of the culmination of that in this series with things like the Mbessa and the Cassante finally coming into full prominence. It's something he's really relied on throughout this year as really big picks. I think both of them have been pretty successful for the most part for KOI. And then even the Scion in game number 4, something he really has not been good on throughout large sections of his career. I thought he was really good on in this series. So credit to Mirwin, credit to Elyoya. I think they stepped up here today. That's not to take anything away from Jojo, Supa, and Alvaro, who I think all were also better than their opposition and pretty solid on the other side of this matchup. It's just more so the gap between the top and jungle than everybody else. Like, I think it was the biggest gap in those two roles because, you know, Oscar and Razork ended up underperforming, but it's clear that Jojo always had pressure in the mid lane, was able to take advantage of some matchups that we saw literally the day before with Poby versus Vladi that Vladi was not able to take advantage of. So definitely a point in favor of Jojo Pune there. And then of course, Supa and Alvaro have been probably the most consistent bot lane in terms of best of fives across this entire year, so you're not super worried about them in any major way. KOI with a nice win to get themselves back to the finals, and I get it. Like, they're not favorites going into that series. We'll talk about it a bit more in the preview, but let's not forget this team came out of lower bracket to get into the finals last split and ended up upsetting G2 in that series to take home a trophy. We'll see if they have the chance to do it again. And then for Fnatic on the other side, this is where their domestic run at the very least ends, but they won this series that really mattered to get themselves to Worlds. This is more of a, you know, ancillary prize, and I think they're still going to be frustrated by the loss. There still are a lot of flaws on this team, and it doesn't necessarily bode well for their international standing that this team performed like this in this series, but, you know, I think this was more expected. I kind of expected them to play like this against Corp, to be entirely frank with you. Oscar Rinnan is going to get done of the series for me. He was obliterated in this series. Again, the KDA is awful, but I think the gameplay kind of matches just how bad the KDA was, and I think for the most part, Mirwin's getting a lot of credit, rightfully so, at least at times, in this series, but most of that to me was Oscar just getting absolutely blasted on the top side and him not really being a relevant player. It's staggering to go from the Corp series to the KOI one here because the difference in the performances out of him in both of those series is just, it's shocking. It's whiplash in terms of going from one series to the next, but Oscar was not good enough. Razork, I think, got completely out-jungled here. You know, we've talked about it pretty extensively on this channel's history, but Razork, not a notoriously good best-of-5 player, you know, was a bit shocked that he stepped up against Yike because that's not how that matchup has typically gone for those two players when they play against each other in big moments, but, you know, credit to Razork. Again, he did fine enough in the series that he was supposed to and then ran this one down, was easily the weaker jungler of the two. And then the rest of the team, I think, was fine. Upset had some really bad positioning moments, but also was playing aggressive enough where I can kind of justify why he was maybe in the spots that he was in. Poby, for the most part, was just a non-factor, was not generating leads in the same way that he was consistently against Vladi because Jojo Pune is just a better laner, and I think we did kind of figure that out. And Mickey X was still going for those aggressive plays, but wasn't in nearly the same kind of spot to be able to deliver on them. This is your typical, like, oh, we lost pressure early and we just don't have the tempo to play these games out. Game 2 was fine. Generally speaking, you were able to play around the Xayah Rakan, which I think is really stable, but KOI was better, and I don't think anybody's questioning that. Now the question is Fnatic going to be able to bounce back and play better internationally, and more importantly, can KOI keep this good train going? They get their rematch against G2 from the upper bracket finals. They've already beaten them once this year in a grand finals. Can they do it twice? Well, I guess we're going to find out now because as we've wrapped up our round 3 and our semifinals coverage, it's time to get into the big one, the LEC finals, the last series of the year domestically here in the LEC, and the biggest one as, of course, we see the number 1 seed from Group B in G2 Esports take on the number 1 seed from Group A in Movistar KOI. This is, of course, a matchup we've seen quite a few times over the course of this year already, and we saw it in upper bracket finals. These were the two teams that ended up qualifying for Worlds first, and now they will face again as a, you know, repeat for what we saw in that upper bracket finals to see who can be your number 1 seed going to Worlds and who can be your LEC champion. As a reminder for how these matchups have gone so far this year, G2 has for the most part been more successful against Movistar KOI. They were able to take them down in upper bracket of this split's playoffs, and they did so as well in the upper bracket of the spring split playoffs, which I think a lot of people forget to get to grand finals. However, in that grand finals that they got their rematch against Movistar KOI in, they were not able to complete the job. In the biggest series that these two teams have played against each other in all year long, Movistar KOI was the team to come out on top, and they did so pretty dominantly with specifically Caps having a really rough series for G2. G2 and not really being able to step up. And so the question now becomes, is the story going to repeat itself? Will Movistar KOI be able to defend the championship that they have gotten back to the finals to try and reclaim? Or will G2 finally be able to hoist a trophy for the first time in 2025? It has been forever since the last time G2 did not have at least one title coming out of a domestic calendar year. I believe we have to go all the way back to 2022 for that to be the case, and even then, like, that was kind of an interruption of a G2 dynasty that we had already been a part of. And so it's not normal, is the point I'm trying to say, for G2 to go an entire calendar year without winning the LEC. This is their shot, this is their redemption, and that's what we've been talking about throughout basically all of the playoffs, is that this feels like the best version of G2 that we've seen all year long, and that they are going to be coming into this series as pretty mega favorites, and I would agree on that front. I do believe that G2 are bigger favorites than they have ever been coming into this series against Movistar KOI, and should be treated like so. Do you guys agree? I'm curious to know if that's what you guys thought of this series going into it, but either way, the only way to find out if it actually lives up to the billing is to go game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. So let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was G2 Esports. They are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up in this series 1-0. And yep, this is the G2 we expected, at least here in game number 1. They come out on fire. They come out with a decently aggressive comp in terms of the way that they want to play the game. And they quite frankly just execute better than Movistar KOI. It wasn't really all that up for debate who the better team in this first game was. Two very key, I guess, diffs in terms of the positions in this series. I guess 3 technical positions, but 2 lanes or 2 parts of the map that ended up really changing things. Jungle and bot lane were really in favor of G2, and I'm gonna be honest, that's the part that I was the most concerned about for G2 going into this series, and just, you know, the part that's been the biggest concern for G2 all year long. Their bot lane has, in my opinion, not really clicked and not been very good throughout most of 2025. I've put a lot of the blame on Hansama. A lot of the community has put a lot of the blame on Labrav. I think the thing that is just true, no matter what you think, is that these two don't necessarily have the most synergistic of playstyles in the entire world, with Hansama being much more 2v2 and early game focused, and Labrav being much more team fight focused in the way that he wants to play the game. However, it does feel like Labrav has started to catch up and has started to play a bit more aggressive, and credit to Hansama, who has been much better, in my opinion, over the course of the summer split at playing a low resource, weak side type of role that can just scale into the late game and allow Skumon and Labrav to play off of each other, which I think has really helped the team out because they're allowed to play a bit slower and a bit more controlled, which does kind of play into the playstyle of basically everybody on this team with the exception of Hans. And so I want to give him a lot of credit for that. He is going to get player of the game for game number 1 here on the Xayah. Really did feel like he was the most impactful player in this first game, at the very least, being able to kind of generate his gigantic lead by 2v2, dominating this Yunara Nautilus on the other side, and then obviously utilizing it to take over the game. Xayah is just one of those champions that it's really tough to stop the snowball once it starts getting a bit out of control, and we know that she can start taking over games. We know that G2 in particular is really good at utilizing Xayah, as they've done the past couple of years, to be able to stabilize down on the bot side. I think it fits what Hans wants to do. It can be relatively good in lane, but it's a hyper carry that doesn't necessarily require a bunch of investment from the rest of the team, not in the same way that things like Yunara or Zeri are going to, where those hyper carries do need you to kind of baby them for a lot of the game and kind of peel off of them. Xayah has self-peel and can generally be a little bit more valuable as that game continues to go along. So credit to Hans, but also credit to the 2 players that I think have received the most amount of community backlash here on G2 throughout this year, Skumon and Labrav, who I think both were really good here in game number 1. The big concern for me going into this series for G2 was not, oh, is Caps going to be good enough? Or hell, is even Skumon or Broken Blade, are they going to be good enough? I had a feeling they were going to be good enough to be able to win a title here. The only question was, can Labrav step up and be better than Alvaro? Because I think support is a really important role right now in the game in terms of how things are progressing with mid-game tempo, especially in the LEC, with how a lot of these teams end up, you know, snowballing games out of control. If you can get one support that's just more active and more aware of what's going on the map than the other support, that's obviously going to be a pretty major advantage. But Labrav outplayed Alvaro for sure here in game number 1, and if that's going to be able to continue, that is probably KOI's biggest advantage kind of out the window. So credit to Labrav. Skumon has been excellent across the summer split. I think this guy has gotten better as the year has gone along. Not that that's entirely surprising. He still is a little bit limited in terms of his playstyles, but he's gotten much better in the mid game, which I think has really increased the tempo of what G2 want to do. When you're talking about like the winter and spring version of Skumon, he was very slow as a player. They could really only function when he was on these big team fight oriented tanks like Maokai and Sejuani, because that was really the only style that he could excel at a top tier level. In the LEC, it does feel like he's gotten a lot better at being able to skirmish in the mid game and open things up. You know, Caps and Broken Blade are the players we're talking about last. Caps honestly was not good in this game. It kind of reminded me a bit of what Caps looked like in the finals last split, but luckily he had his team bailing him out with a really good game at number 1. And for KOI on the other side, they were just outplayed. Like, there's not really a lot to say. It didn't really feel like this team was on the same wavelength in terms of how they wanted to play the game, and it certainly did not feel the same as what happened when they went up against Fnatic, where they basically did the exact same thing to them, just now they're on the other side. Now they're on the losing side of that argument. Dead of the game can go quite a few ways. I considered Alvaro, who I am going to give it to here on the Nautilus. I considered Supa on the Unara, who I think had a lot of positioning mistakes. I considered Elyoya on the Maokai, who I think was significantly too slow in this series. Even Jojo Pune on the Rise, he was aggressive, but oftentimes maybe a bit too aggressive in this game. There were a lot of different options, I think, for dead of the game when it came to KOI, because I think everything was just so up in the air when it came to this team. But one thing is for sure, they weren't really able to land on any successful plays throughout this. They were able to pull back gold through the mistakes of players like Caps, but they weren't really creating a lot of action on their own front. They really relied on G2 messing up, and that's always going to be a pretty dangerous spot for you to be in. I like KOI as a team, and we've already talked about them quite a bit in this video already, you know, going over that series against Fnatic. But if Alvaro's going to get dead of the game like he did here on the Nautilus, if Supa's going to be really far behind and Hansama's going to be able to outplay him as an AD carry, and specifically if Elyoya is not going to have the tempo against someone like Skewmond, yeah, things are going to get a lot more difficult. Those are the exact matchups that you kind of need to win in order to stay relevant in a series like this. So going into game number 2, I don't just want to see KOI pick up the victory. Obviously, you need to see KOI pick up the victory. You cannot drop 2-0 to G2. That is a nightmare scenario. You do not want to be in a position where you have to win 3 in a row against G2 Esports. But even more so than that, when they win, they need to show that they can win through these positions that are supposed to be strengths for them over a team like G2 from a talent perspective. If not, then going into game 3, they're still going to be looking at a pretty big uphill battle, but it's a must win for KOI. And quite frankly, it's a bit of a must win for G2. If you get this kind of lead, you do not want to relinquish it. You want to capitalize on it by getting that 2-0 series lead. So are they going to be able to do it? Well, the winner of game number 2 was G2 Esports. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to go up in this series 2-0, and they look dominant right now. They are winning in so many areas that I just did not expect them to win in. They are better in so many areas that I did not expect them to be better in. This is a phenomenal looking G2. You know, I said at the beginning of this segment that they were the best they've looked all year, and I don't think that that's really a question. I think that that was the case going into this series. Hell, I think that was the case going into the playoffs. Just in general, it was clear that something had changed about this team coming back from MSI and from the EWC that had made them better. They had learned a lot from that experience and been able to grow because they weren't very good at that tournament. They were very one-dimensional in terms of their playstyle, and they've come back and they've done really well to be able to adapt and evolve. But I mean, if there was ever a series that completely, you know, pushed that narrative forward, it is absolutely this one right now, because they're not only winning, they're winning in completely different ways than they did at any other point in the year. I mean, this is a very well-rounded team with the way that they are producing right now in the finals, and that is really cool to see. For Movistar KOI, man, this team is making mistakes. They are just not clinical. They are not clean, and we kind of knew that going into the year. I mean, for a lot of 2025, they were considered the 4th best team in the LEC, and I think it's pretty easy to see why when you watch them play the game in the way that they do, because they're going to make mistakes. They are going to be too far forward. They're going to glide the wrong direction. You're going to have a Zeri who's constantly running into danger and killing himself. Like, there are going to be mistakes on the side of KOI. We know that the upside can be there, and sometimes those plays end up turning out really good for the team because they have enough mechanical skill to be able to pull them off. But when they don't, it looks really bad, and that's exactly what we saw here. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game for me, kind of hard, like in this one for G2. I believe there are 3 good options. They're the exact same 3 as the previous game. It's Skewmond, it's Hansama, it's Labrav. They are the 3 players that are absolutely pushing the game forward right now for G2. I'm leaning towards Skewmond in this one just for the kill participation, but let me tell you, man, I really wanted to give this one to Labrav James. Like, I thought he was so good on the Alistar. This was such a good Alistar game from him to be able to set everything up, and Hansama was gliding on the Sivir. Certainly the better AD carry in this game and in this series so far, I think, is the major point that I want to make. But it's hard to really deny just how good Skewmond has been. The tempo, the aggression. You know, the Jarvan and Zinzhao matchup, I think, is very Jarvan favored. I think that there are a lot of parts of the matchup that are difficult for Zinzhao to play because of the lockup potential coming in from Jarvan, kind of making it difficult difficult for Xin to be as aggressive as maybe he would want to be in a lot of these skirmishes, but at the same time, you still have to go out there and execute on it. It's not a free game by any stretch of the imagination, and I think Skumond went out and really proved that. Remember, Elyoya picked Xin Zhao into Jarvan. Like, this is a matchup he wanted to play out, even if I don't like it, and Skumond very much took advantage of it. Awesome game, just overall awesome series. Skumond has really grown and blossomed, I think, into one of the best junglers in the West. I'm not willing to say he is the best jungler in the West just yet. I still think he has downsides. Again, his early games, specifically his pre-10 minutes, are not the most electric in the entire world. That was not the case here in game number 2, but I'm just talking about, like, wholeheartedly. Like, when you look at the whole breadth of his entire season, that's kind of been the case. But everything after 10 minutes at this point is really good. He's really evolved into being, like I said, a very strong mid-game player alongside being a great team fighter, which he already was, and I think it just makes him very dangerous moving forward. But like I said, if the bot lane's going to play like this, all of my worries about G2 are probably going to go to the wayside, because my biggest concern with G2 is, do they have the bot lane that actually allows them to compete at the international level? I did not think that was going to be the case. I honestly thought going into Worlds, Caps was going to be good, Broken Blade was probably going to figure it out, and I thought Skumond was making great developments. Those were the 3 players that I felt comfortable on. I just did not think that Hansama and Labrov were ever going to click as a duo because of their lack of synergy in terms of how they play the game. However, that was wrong. They have figured it out, at the very least here in the finals. Now, there is a caveat to make, and I'll make this even more depending on how the rest of the series ends up going, but every single year Hansama gets finals MVP in the summer split, or just in one of the splits he ends up popping off domestically in the playoffs and everybody talks him up again, and then he goes to Worlds and he absolutely shits the bed. I'm not going to sit here and pretend like I'm not preparing for that to happen again, but at the very least, he's completing the part of the program there that's really good for G2, which is playing really well domestically in the finals. Hans, Labrov, they look great. Caps and Broken Blade have taken a complete background role. Caps was actually just not good in game number 1. I think he was much more, I don't want to say useless, but like irrelevant in game number 2, and that's kind of a good thing. Just overall, Jarvan took over the game in terms of the macro. You didn't really need the Galio to be able to dominate things. You just needed to take Jojo Pune out of the game to make sure he didn't have the damage to enable the Xin Zhao to play more aggressive. And quite frankly, once again, it's Skumond, it's Hans, it's Labrov, and it's not Caps or BB that are carrying the team. It's the new blood kind of coming in, the players that were questioned the most at the beginning of the year, and you have to be excited for that. And then for Movistar KOI, what do you want me to say, man? Like, this team is just kind of, they're losing in the way that they've lost all year long. They're overly greedy. Their positioning is not very good from behind. They're very aggressive in terms of the way they want to play. And even the players that I would consider to be the most consistent on the team aren't exactly brimming with consistency. As we can see here, Supa is my dud of the game here. I love Supa. You guys know I'm a big fan of him on this channel, but this has not been a very good series for him. Hansama has really just outperformed him in basically every single category. Not exactly what you want to see out of what people would consider your superstar, your Supa star AD carry down in the bot lane here for Movistar KOI, but Alvaro is also getting outplayed. Elyoya is getting completely out-jungled through the first 2 games. He's not going to be picking up a dud of the game for either of the first 2, but I think it's reasonable to say that he could have gotten it for either because his tempo was super far behind. This game, I think, was a little bit more understandable. Once again, the matchup is not all that favorable, but at the same time, like, you on blue side ended up picking yourself into this matchup that I don't really like. So, already kind of a negative on that front. Jojo, I think, has been probably their best player so far in this series, but he's also dying a ton. He's playing way too far forward and playing really aggressive. He at least is trading something back in terms of gold and resources, getting some kills onto himself, being able to pick up some kills specifically onto Caps, but outside of that, there's just not a lot going on for the rest of the team. And like I said, Supa's positioning in this game was just miserably bad. His KDA is not going to tell you exactly the positions that he was in to get him those 5 deaths throughout this game. So KOI needs to figure it out. They are 1 game away from getting swept out of the finals, not just losing it, but not picking up a single game win, which after taking down G2 in the finals last split would be considered a massive disappointment for this team. And then for G2 on the other side, this is kind of huge. If this team can sweep their way through the finals and to that LEC trophy after, questing after it for the entirety of the year, that is massive for this team's confidence and their momentum going into Worlds. This team should be the kings of Europe. Can they solidify that here? Well, the winner of game number 3 was G2 Esports. They are going to take game number 3. They are going to take this series in a clean 3-0 sweep, and your 2025 Summer Split champions are finally G2 Esports. It does come to fruition. They do win a trophy in 2025, despite the fact that it really looked like they weren't going to for most of this year. They do get across the hurdle, and they do so in dominant fashion here in game number 3 and in the finals, where they just destroy KOI, and it's really not close. Level 1, this game is over. It's a 2v2 invade from Skewmon and Labrov to completely destroy Alvaro and Elyoya. Elyoya staying and fighting for his red buff and just dying on Skarner to completely throw away his entire game, and by proxy, the entire series here for KOI is certainly not the way I would want my game number 3 to go if I'm down 2-0, but to each their own, I guess. Maybe sometimes you just want to lose quickly so that you can get it over with, but certainly did feel like a bit of a rage game from KOI and a dominant performance from G2 to really secure their spot. There is no denying at this point that going into the World Championships, G2 is the best team coming out of the LEC. Now, where you want to put that in terms of global expectation, I think is fairly criticized right now because the LEC has not produced internationally a ton so far this year, and also I think the level of play in the LEC has just kind of been a little bit low, if I'm being entirely honest, but you know, that's a conversation for Worlds coverage. Right now, we are here to prop up G2 and talk about what exactly they have accomplished here today. Pretty easy to talk about their accomplishments. I think that's probably the easiest possible place to start. Player of the game here for game number 3 is going to go to Labrov for me. He was part of that level 1 invade alongside Skewmon with the Volley Bear on this Karma, and not only was he able to completely destroy Elyoya's game, he completely destroyed Alvaro's game as well on the Nico on the other side of this matchup. Hell, he even made Jojo Pune's life really hard on the Azir. This was a clear Labrov player of the game for me, and honestly, I do kind of want to give him Finals MVP. I think it is up in the air. Like I said, him and Skewmon, I think, really are kind of the two that are fighting over Finals MVP. Hansama very much in the conversation as well, if you do want to go in that direction. Basically, anybody that isn't Broken Blade or Caps, I think, could theoretically be Finals MVP here for G2. But I am going to lean in favor of Labrov. I really do think he was the best player on the Rift here today. I think his impact on all 3 games was the most unanimous, and I'm really just impressed by how good he's been over the course of this domestic playoff run. This is the best he's played on G2 by far. I've always been a big fan of Labrov. I've always propped him up a lot on this channel, going back to the Vitality days when he was playing with Comp, like early on as a rookie, and then obviously like that super team Vitality that ends up going completely terribly and just everything kind of going wrong. He goes over to BDS as kind of a redemption arc, and he does more than that. He becomes the best support in the entire league on Team BDS, a super consistent team fighting player that pairs perfectly with somebody like Ice over there to be able to consistently win them games. Even Crown Shot, like him and Crowny were excellent as a duo down on the bot side. Like Labrov has just found a ton of success playing with a lot of different AD carries, and then he moves over here to G2. G2 reportedly choosing, Labrov and wanting to go for that. Now, the question is, like, was Paris the first choice option and BDS just didn't want to give him up to pair Paris alongside Skewmon? Would Paris has been as good here? Obviously, Paris was worse, but he didn't get the G2 infrastructure. Like, all of these conversations. But Labrov is, in my opinion, the best performing support in the LEC over the totality of the past 2 years, even if Mickey X has been significantly better this year, and someone like Alvaro might even have a real strong argument to be in that conversation as well. But Finals MVP, I think, capstones that really well for a player that's been scrutinized and criticized and, kind of scapegoated so much for G2. I'm really glad to see him step up in the biggest moment. Skewmon as well, the other player that I think a lot of people have been questioning. I've been, growing on Skewmon a lot. I've talked about it on the channel as we've gone throughout the summer split. Even in spring, I was really at the point where I was giving him first team All-Pro nod for spring already, even if I wasn't exactly super high on his individual gameplay. I felt like he was limited. He's grown a lot as a player, and not only that, but I think he has shown that he has the mentality that will allow him to be great here in the LEC. There are sometimes some questions about whether or not these really talented players that maybe have more limited skill sets have the ceiling to continue to grow. Skewmon was already a really good prospect, and all he has done since getting to the LEC is get better, and I think that that is the biggest trait. Like, a lot of people ask me, like, how do I evaluate certain players? Obviously position by position, it can be very dependent, but I feel like the reason that I'm so successful at being able to find young players that have a lot of room to grow is because it's really easy to spot when a player has maximized the ceiling, or when they're always just going to be limited in a certain area, when they don't really have the capacity to grow out of traits. And as minuscule as it can be sometimes to try and spot, where these growths come from, when a player consistently gets better over time, that's a player you can pretty consistently rely on becoming a very good player. It's not always going to be the case. I've had a lot of misses as well, but when you see someone like Skewmon who joins as somebody that already has an immense amount of talent and then continues to get better, yeah, that fills me with confidence that he's going to be a really solid player. It's the same feeling I had, obviously to a lesser extent about someone like, Carlson for most of this year, or You know, what we saw last year with someone like Vladi when he ended up entering the league and got better basically every single game. This is kind of the pinnacle of LCK development, where players like Delight and Duro have consistently been able to showcase the ability to improve even on bad teams before they get plucked by good teams and get better over the course of time. When you are consistently able to improve your game and learn and grow and take on new aspects of it, improve the parts that you're not very good at, that's always going to turn into something that is valuable for a team, because you immediately become a lot more versatile and you showcase your ability to be a team player. And I think that's what Skewmond has done so far. If you want to give him finals MVP, I have absolutely no issue with that. And Hansama was also excellent. He arguably played all 3 games the best of anybody. Like, his dynamism this series was really good. He was the carry in all 3 of these games in terms of the damage that was coming out. And so really hard to kind of bet against him. I think it should go to one of those 3 players. They were all phenomenal. You know, Caps and Broken Blade were along for the ride. And I think that's the best case scenario for G2, is that you can genuinely look at a finals performance and say that Broken Blade and Caps were the 2 players that I mentioned the absolute least for the winning side in a 3-0 stomp. It's awesome stuff for G2, and it really bodes well for them internationally. And then for KOI on the other side, some real issues with this team. I'm not going to pretend like this is their best series or their worst series or anything like that. This is a weird one to kind of talk about, because it's clear that by game number 3, they were just so mentally tilted out of their minds. They were not really locked in and playing this game at a top tier level. You can't really do that in the finals. That's not a great showcase from a mental perspective, but it kind of is what it is. This team was getting dumpstered, and then Elyoya dies level 1 and the game is over. Elyoya is dud of the series, or dud of the game. We don't do a dud of the series for these big, you know, final series. I don't think that's necessarily fair when we're breaking it down game by game. You get a general idea of where these players end up falling, but Elyoya was bad here today, man. He got completely out jungled by Skewmond, and like I said, he kind of created his own problems for a majority of this series. He needed to be better. This is the exact opposite of what happened last finals, where he stepped up, played his best series all year long, and ended up out-dueling G2 to get them that spring split trophy. He was nowhere close to being able to do anything against Skewmond in this series, so Elyoya not looking great. I think JoJo just played his worst game of the entire series on the Azir. Supa and Alvaro were consistently getting outplayed by Hansama and Labrav. Alvaro had a terrible series, certainly one of his worst that he's maybe ever played in Tier 1. Mirwin was a complete non-factor, but I guess technically so was Broken Blade on the top side. Not a series to remember for Movistar KOI. However, they are still going to Worlds as the number 2 seed. They still get the chance to go immediately into the Swiss stage. Of course, no play-ins necessary for any of the Western teams because of the way the format is set up. You don't really have to worry about qualifying, but KOI needs to start figuring things out. They don't have another tournament to ramp up. This is going to be the last image that we see from Movistar KOI before we get to Worlds. And while they looked great against a team like Fnatic, there are real question marks about how good a team like Fnatic actually is. I think that I am concerned that Movistar KOI might not be the team that everybody is expecting going to Worlds, but their inherent, you know, up and downness, I think, gives them a ceiling that we didn't necessarily get a chance to see here today. But for G2, they are the kings of Europe once more. They continue to reign over this region. They have gotten their crown back just in time for the biggest international tournament of the year. The question is now, can they kind of avenge some of their previous performances? They have been back-to-back champions many times over the past couple of years, and that's not translated to World success. They've not been able to make it out of the Swiss stage either of the last 2 years. They've looked weaker this year than they had any of the last 2 years. Does that bode well for this team? Does the fact that they are getting better and kind of peaking at the right time mean that they're going to get even better going to Worlds? That is the question now. Can G2 overperform their expectations and put the weight of this LEC region on their back once again? All right, but that is going to do it for my LEC Round 3 Semifinals and Finals overview and analysis video, and that's going to do it for my domestic LEC coverage here in 2025. Congratulations once again to your 2025 Summer Split champions, G2 Esports. Specifically, congratulations to Skewmond and Labrav, who are both winning their first ever LEC title. Skewmond in his first year as a rookie here, but Labrav, a longtime veteran of the LEC, has been playing for half a decade at this point at a top tier level and has finally been able to hoist the championship here, the big trophy at the end of the LEC year. He's worked very hard to be a champion in Europe, and now he has finally accomplished those goals. Is he going to be able to translate that into success elsewhere at Worlds? That's the question now, because we've got 3 teams going to Worlds to represent the LEC. G2 is the number 1 seed, Movistar KOI is the number 2 seed, and Fnatic as the number 3 seed. I myself don't have a lot of high hopes for these 3 teams. You know, no spoilers for my power rankings, but I would be be, you know, a bit hesitant to maybe call any of them favorites to get out of the Swiss stage. I just don't necessarily see that as the path right now for the LEC. I think their gameplay, especially domestically, has been very low quality. There were some flashes shown from teams like G2 and KOI internationally. K-Corp, of course, getting to finals of first stand, but they went 1-4 or whatever in the regular stage of that. I'm not going to sit here and pretend like K-Corp is a great team with no flaws or anything like that. It's more so just this situation where, you know, LEC just hasn't performed all that well so far in 2025. I think the talent of the region or the overall consistency of the region has gone down, and now the real question is, can they step up and bring it back? Let me know what you think down in the comment section below. Very curious to know what your thoughts and opinions are down there in terms of whether or not you think more highly of the LEC and these teams than I do going into Worlds. But that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we're done with the LEC. The LTA finals and semifinals video is going to be coming out tomorrow, and then after that, we're wrapping up domestic play. It's over and it's done with, and that means it's just Worlds time for the rest of 2025. And of course, the LTA promotion tournament. We might cover ASI on this channel as well. We're going to have content all, you know, Worlds season long, if you want to call it that. And then, of course, off-season content around the corner as well. So if you're interested in any of that stuff, go ahead and hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all